preservation of a language. And our guest in studio here in Johannesburg is Dr. Rakwena Monareng, who is the CEO of the Pan South African Language Board. Seated next to him is Mr. Elijah Mhlanga, who is a DJ of Communication at the Department of Basic Education. In our Polokwane studio in Limpopo, we are joined by author, poet, and art movement leader Vunani Bila. And then in our Mahikeng studio, we are joined by writer, poet, and cultural activist pt3 Modimoeng, and we're all talking about language. Doctor, one of the things that you mentioned that stuck with me is that we are out of order in conducting this interview in English, but it's also the way the system has been set up. Mr. Elijah, let me bring you into this conversation because I do want to pick up on the one thing, the system. A little bit earlier, you spoke about that there is not enough teachers or educated enough in language proficiency in order to teach that at a school level. We find ourselves 20-odd years into our democracy with an issue as pervasive and as emotional as language. How do we then overcome those issues if it's a system issue? Institutions like Pan South are doing their bit. Vunani is doing his bit. pt3 is doing his bit. There are other organizations doing their bit. And yet we're still talking about the basic right to linguistic access to language, promotion of language.
Well, from our side, we incentivize and create interest for young people who want to teach in African indigenous languages in our schools by giving them bursaries through the Funza Lushaka bursary scheme. That's why to us, the practice at universities, they come as a huge concern because it means that some of those teachers that were supposed to start teaching next year might not be able to do so if the academic program is lost. But that's what we do. We give them bursaries and we put strict conditions to say that if you want this bursary, you need to agree that you will be going to the foundation phase of primary schools to teach in indigenous African languages because we realize that there's a huge shortage of teachers there as much as there's a huge shortage of material written in African languages.
Okay, let me throw my second question at you because I'm struggling to remember. I think it was pt3 was talking about there's not enough incentives for people in order to speak in their language. You're saying there are incentives around the education space. What are some of those incentives? Like you talked about bursaries, for example.
Yeah, it's just a bursary. You know, from the education side, there's only something that we can do, but everyone else needs to play their bit. What we need to do is remember that learning does not start in school. It starts at home, where a child, the parents, everyone in the household communicate in the language of their choice, their home language. And if they make that request to us as education to say, we want this language to be taught in this school, our responsibility and duty is to make that language available and to provide the resources for such language to prosper in that community. But what we find is that parents do not choose their home languages, they choose other languages, which make the job very difficult for us.
I'm going to ask everybody just to keep their responses a little bit shorter. pt3, let me bring you into this conversation because I think Mr. Mhlanga has said a very important thing. That, I mean, there's the role of government, there's the role of institutions, but learning does start at home. And if parents are not teaching their heritage and their language to their children, or they themselves don't understand it well enough, how is government or institutions like Pan South making inroads if, I mean, you could take a horse to the water, but if it doesn't drink, it's pointless.
Indeed. And I think it goes beyond families as well, the entertainment aspect of things, you know. You would believe that the quality of our entertainment, the content thereof, is an illustration or a mirror image of the consciousness of us as a people, as society. So if we dance to you know, songs that do not represent who we are, then it means by the day we take ourselves further from achieving that which we are trying to. But the other critical point, you know, there's a phenomenon of now late of just Googling names. You Google a name, you know, you are, you know, a Mosotho, you know, a Zulu, or even a Motswana for that matter. You Google a name when you have a newly born child, you know, instead of preserving the name of your forefathers or your, you know, great-grandmother, so that the kid, when the child grows up, rather, you know, you can then narrate to the child that, you know, your name is Motlalekomo, because Motlalekomo was your great-grandfather. This was the significance of the name, through that whole narration and oral history. So it's not only a question of our everyday usage of language, but it's the broader consciousness aspect. Because if we fail to do that, we cannot blame the Department of Basic Education and say why our language is unscientific. We need to preserve them, use them in our everyday life, so that they can then grow towards that. It's like a flower garden. You work on it, otherwise, it dies.
So let me come back to that fundamental point and let's break it down. I don't know if I'm oversimplifying it, but I'm going to ask you to keep your response very quickly. We talk yet again about the role that the households play, that ordinary citizens play. There are so many interventions. There are so many people that I know that are fighting for this on a day-to-day basis. Yet ordinary families on the ground are refusing to speak their languages. They talk in English. They wherever they find their comfortability, it's not in the languages that they grew up in. Why? And I want to throw that to Vernani as well. Very quickly, why are we as South Africans not speaking our first languages?
It's because we think, if you speak English, if your 5-year-old son speaks English, he's more intelligent than a 5-year-old in the villages who speaks the mother tongue. I mean, that one is as simple as that. We measure intelligence based on English. We take our kids to private schools for the best education, and we are then instructed not to speak to them in our mother tongues. So, forgetting that the human brain is capable of absorbing many languages at once. So that's the simplicity of it. We take pride, in divorcing ourselves from who we are. And I think it begins with the language part, then it grows into the broader consciousness, as I've said.
Okay, I have to come to Vernani, but I was instructed to take an ad break. When we come back, we'll ask that question as well, to why are South Africans not speaking their first language? If there are so many interventions okay, maybe let me get that response very quickly from Vernani. Vernani, there's so many interventions. I've thrown this question out there. South Africans are not speaking their first languages. They're comfortable in English, or they've adopted the English language. We've heard Kebetswe saying that when your 5-year-old son is talking English, it's a measure of intelligence. But if we are fighting to preserve our languages, why have we put English as the standard? Who has put English as the standard?
Well, thanks for the question. I think, it's not only English, but English and Afrikaans have become, hegemonic languages in South Africa. There are reasons for that, why perhaps parents and, everyone else in the community prefer to use English. One is that they see English as a language of power, that they use it for all sorts of, purposes, business, legal, and all that. But why people are refusing to speak African languages, I think it's a mental attitude that they, belittle themselves. They see themselves as less important, and it's something that we've inherited from our past. And I think it's continued by government by not making African languages a priority. For instance, you hardly hear parliamentarians speak in African languages. There are few books that are available in schools that are written in indigenous languages. Of the more than 3,000 libraries that we have in the country, very few stock books in African languages. So it's also a structural problem that is perpetuated by those who wield power, and in this case, government. I think government does not prioritize African languages, despite the establishment of PENSALP and the promulgation of the language policy. And when people see themselves as less important, they also see their language as less important. And for that reason, private schools are preferred over public schools by those who have money. So it becomes a class issue as well, that English and nothing else will take you to heaven, when in fact the majority of South Africans live in the periphery. They live in rural areas. That indicates that, a lot of people are anchored into their languages. But it's not entirely true that people prefer English, because if you check our music is composed in African languages. There are lots of praise poets who do it in African languages, and rituals are largely performed, linked to African traditions and so on. And so language preservation, I don't think it's a key challenge. What we need to alter is government priorities.
Okay, Manani Bila, I think you've raised some interesting issues. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time on the show to tackle more issues. I do think that I'm going to ask the producers if we can continue this conversation. It is very, very interesting. Manani Bila talking to us out of Polokwane, Limpopo studio, author, poet, and art movement leader. I think we are all in consensus that we haven't reached the end of this conversation, and there's just too many issues to deal with. In our Mahikeng studio, Keobetswe Modimoeng, who is the writer, poet, and cultural activist. Thank you very much for your contribution. Here in Johannesburg, we've had the privilege of having the CEO of the Pan-South African Language Board, Dr. Rakwena Mpomonareng. I know, Dr. we didn't spend enough time unpacking some of your issues. And then from the Department of Basic Education, the DG of Communication, Mr. Elijah Mshlanga. Sir, thank you very much. And I think there's some pertinent issues you've raised. We have to unpack them in much more detail. Unfortunately, we run out of time. We take an ad break. When we come back, we'll have a chat to artists.